All right, so you guys are interested in men's rights, the red pill, and how that all intersects with the legal system. Well, today, we are going to take a deep dive into a book from 1908. Yeah, you heard that right, 1908.
Wow, going way back.
I know, right? It's called The Legal Subjection of Men by Belfort Bax. And this book, it really challenges some assumptions about the way we think about legal history and the roles of men and women.
Yeah, this book is fascinating, and it was written at such a pivotal time, too.
Yes.
The early 1900s, think about it. That's
Yeah.
when the women's rights movement was really gaining momentum. Society was undergoing some massive shifts.
Totally. So, like, set the scene for us a little bit. Like, what was going on back then? What was the vibe?
Well, you have to imagine a world where women were just starting to demand things like the right to vote, the right to own property. It was a time of both progress and a lot of pushback. And so you have this book, The Legal Subjection of Men, that comes out, and it's arguing that men, not women, were actually the ones facing legal disadvantages.
Oh,
I know, right?
hold on. Seriously. That's the complete opposite of what we hear today.
Right, it's like flipping the script.
Totally.
But that's what makes this book so interesting, especially for those of you exploring the red pill philosophy.
Okay, so this Belfort Bax guy, he was, like, going against the grain even back then.
Oh, absolutely. He was definitely challenging the prevailing narrative about gender and power.
I'm hooked. Let's dive into this core argument. What exactly did he mean by the legal subjection of men? Like, give me the juicy details.
So Bax lays out a really detailed argument,
Okay.
and he claims that men faced legal disadvantages in all sorts of areas: marriage, divorce, property rights, you name it. He even argues that men were at a disadvantage in criminal law.
Whoa. Criminal law, too.
Oh, yeah, he goes there.
Okay, that's wild. All right, so how does he back up these claims? What kind of examples does he use?
Well, one of the examples that might really resonate with the red pill crowd is the concept of breach of promise lawsuits.
Breach of promise? I've never even heard of that.
Yeah. So back then, if a man broke off an engagement, a woman could actually sue him for it.
Get out of here.
No, seriously. And often, the courts would side with the woman, awarding her damages for the broken promise. Can you believe that?
So even back then, like over 100 years ago, men were being held accountable for what happened in relationships.
Exactly. And it highlights the power dynamics that were at play, even in something as personal as a broken engagement.
Okay, so that's breach of promise. What about divorce? I bet that gets even more interesting.
Oh, you bet it does.
Like, what was the deal with alimony and property division back then?
Bax goes deep into that. He talks about how men were often required to financially support their ex-wives, even if the woman initiated the divorce. And there was often a lack of reciprocity, like it wasn't a two-way street.
Interesting. So it sounds like this idea of a covert contract, like unspoken expectations and obligations, was already a thing back then, even if they didn't use that term.
It's a fascinating parallel, right? And Bax was very aware of this imbalance and how it was playing out in the legal system.
Okay, breach of promise, alimony. We're already seeing some echoes of modern-day red pill concepts here. What other legal rabbit holes did this Bax guy explore?
Oh, there are some real head-scratchers in here.
Like what?
Okay, so there was something called the doctrine of coercion, which basically assumed that a wife was acting under her husband's influence if she committed a crime, even if she was the one who came up with the plan.
Wait, seriously. Even if the woman was the mastermind, the man was still considered responsible.
You got it. It's pretty wild when you think about it from a modern perspective, but it was a reflection of the legal and social norms of the time.
So even if a woman, like, robbed a bank or something, the husband could be held accountable.
Potentially, yeah. It's almost like a reverse toxic masculinity situation.
It's like toxic femininity, right?
It's a fascinating contrast to how we think about these things today.
Totally. Okay, give me another one. What else did Bax dig up?
Well, he also argued that husbands were held responsible for their wives' civil wrongs like debts or slander, even if they had no control over their wives' actions.
No way.
Yeah.
So if a wife, like, went on a spending spree,
Yep.
the husband was on the hook for the bills.
That's what Bax is saying. He argues that men were basically held liable for things they didn't even do.
That's crazy. It's like they had no individual agency.
It raises a really important question, right? How much responsibility did men have for their wives' actions back then? It speaks to the whole idea of individual autonomy within a marriage.
This is blowing my mind. It's like looking through a time warp at our own time. I mean, we talk about accountability and responsibility in relationships today, but Bax was grappling with these same concepts over 100 years ago.
It's remarkable how relevant his work still feels, especially for those of you trying to understand the complexities of modern relationships.
All right, we've got breach of promise, alimony, the doctrine of coercion, and now this whole thing about husbands being responsible for their wives' debts and stuff. This is heavy stuff.
Oh, yeah, and we're just getting started.
I know this is just the tip of the iceberg, right?
Yeah.
We've only scratched the surface of Bax's argument. But I'm already seeing all these connections to some of the red pill concepts you guys are talking about.
Oh, absolutely. And as we get into some of the specific cases that Bax presents, I think those connections are going to become even more apparent.
Okay, I am ready. Bring on the cases.
All right, buckle up. We're going deep.
I'm ready.
All right, let's do it. So we've talked about some of the broad legal concepts that Bax lays out in his book.
Yeah, like breach of promise and alimony and that crazy doctrine of coercion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's wild.
But he doesn't stop there.
Okay.
He actually goes deep into real-life cases.
Oh, this is where it gets good. I love a good story.
T2.
Ew.
And these cases are, well, they're really something.
All right, lay it on me. What kind of cases are we talking about here?
Well, one area that Bax really focuses on is divorce proceedings.
Makes sense. And he brings up these cases where it seems like women were using accusations of assault or adultery to gain leverage in the divorce?
Whoa, hold on. So they were like making false accusations just to get a better outcome in court?
That's what Bax seems to be suggesting. He argues that women knew the system was more likely to believe them, especially back then, and they use that to their advantage.
Wow, that's messed up. It's like they were playing the game, knowing the rules were rigged in their favor. It makes you think about all those stories you hear today about false accusations and how much damage they can do.
Right. And it's important to remember that these cases happened over 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So the social context was very different. But they definitely raised some questions about how the system dealt with situations where the truth was hard to figure out.
Okay, so divorce is one area where Bax found some interesting cases. What else?
Well, he also dug up instances of women committing bigamy.
Bigamy.
Yeah, marrying multiple men at the same time,
Oh.
or engaging in other crimes and seemingly getting away with it, or at least facing much lighter punishments than men would have for similar offenses.
Seriously. So there was like a double standard back then?
It seems that way, yeah. Bax points to these cases as evidence that the system was not always fair or consistent in how it treated men and women.
That's crazy. It's like they were living in a completely different world.
It's definitely a different world from what we're used to today.
Totally. And these cases, they really resonate with that whole red pill idea that there's this hidden system at play, a system that benefits women at the expense of men.
It's an interesting connection, for sure.
Okay, so we've got divorce, we've got bigamy. What else? Did Bax find any other shocking examples of this legal inequality?
Oh, yeah. He also talks about cases of women using libel, slander, and even blackmail to extort money from men.
No way. So they were basically using their femininity as a weapon.
That's what Bax is arguing. He says that women exploited societal expectations of chivalry and used them to manipulate men into giving them money or other advantages.
It's like they were playing the victim role to get what they wanted.
It's definitely a dark side of the gender dynamics of that era. And it's a reminder that power can be used in all sorts of ways, sometimes in ways that are really harmful.
This is mind-blowing stuff.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, if Bax was writing today, what would he be saying about the modern dating landscape and all the challenges that men face?
That's a great question. I think he'd have a lot to say.
I bet he would.
It's fascinating to think about how his insights from over a century ago could be applied to the complexities of relationships today.
All right, so we've been talking about these individual cases that Bax uncovered, but I'm curious about the bigger picture here. Like, what was the social context in which he was writing? What were the prevailing attitudes towards gender roles, marriage, and divorce back then?
Well, imagine a society where women were just starting to push for greater equality.
Okay.
They were entering the workforce in larger numbers. They were demanding the right to vote and own property.
So a lot like today in some ways, right?
Yeah, except it was all happening for the first time.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of pushback from those who wanted to maintain the traditional order.
It sounds like a really turbulent time.
It was. And Bax was right in the middle of it. He was witnessing firsthand how these changes were impacting relationships, families, and the legal system.
And I bet he was picking up on the anxiety that a lot of men were feeling at the time, right? Like they were losing their place in society.
Oh, absolutely. He definitely tapped into that sentiment. He argued that in the rush to empower women, the legal system had gone too far in the other direction and had left men vulnerable and disadvantaged.
It's like that pendulum swing, you know,
Yeah.
It swings one way, then it swings back the other.
Exactly. And Bax was pointing out that even with the best intentions, social progress can sometimes create unintended consequences.
So he was like a voice of caution, a voice of reason amidst all this social upheaval.
In a way, yeah. He was urging people to consider all sides of the issue, to think about the impact of these changes on both men and women.
And that's something we can still learn from today.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we're still figuring out how to navigate these issues of gender and equality.
Absolutely. And Bax's work reminds us that it's a complex process. There are always going to be challenges and trade-offs, but we need to keep the conversation going and strive for a society that is fair and just for everyone.
Well said.
Oh,
Okay, so we've talked about the cases, we've talked about the social context, but Bax didn't just focus on the legal system in the abstract, did he? He also delved into specific social forces that were at play back then, right?
he did, yeah. He was a very insightful social commentator.
Okay, so what were some of the other things he was observing about the world around him?
Well, one thing that he talks about is the role of class.
Okay.
He argues that you can't really understand the legal inequalities of that era without taking into account the impact of economic disparity.
So it's not just about gender, it's about power in a broader sense.
Exactly. A wealthy woman, even back then, might have had a very different experience with the legal system than a poor woman.
Makes sense.
And the same goes for men.
Right. Bax emphasizes that class played a huge role in shaping legal outcomes, regardless of gender.
It's like even back then, money talked.
It did.
And it probably still does today.
Probably so. It's something to think about for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So class is one factor that Bax brings into the conversation. What else? Well, he also spends a lot of time talking about the changing attitudes towards marriage and divorce during that period.
Okay.
Remember, this was a time when divorce was becoming more socially acceptable, especially among the upper and middle classes.
Yeah, it's like a whole new world was opening up.
It was. And Bax saw both the positive and negative potential in that.
Interesting.
He recognized that divorce could be a way for people to escape unhappy or abusive relationships, but he also worried about the potential impact on families and children.
It sounds like he was trying to find a balance, like he wanted to protect people's rights without undermining the institution of marriage.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. He was grappling with these really complex social issues and trying to figure out what the best way forward was.
And this is all happening at the same time that the women's rights movement is gaining steam.
Exactly. The women's rights movement was a major force for change during this period.
Yeah.
And they were advocating for things like greater autonomy for women within marriage, the right to divorce in cases of abuse or infidelity.
So it sounds like there was a lot of tension and conflict between the traditional view of marriage and the more progressive views that were emerging.
Absolutely. And Bax was right in the middle of that debate.
So he wasn't just writing about legal theory.
Right.
He was really trying to understand the lived experiences of people during a time of immense social change.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes his work so relevant even today. He was asking questions about power, equality, and the role of the legal system that are still relevant in the 21st century.
Okay, this is all incredibly fascinating, but I have to ask, how much of what Bax was writing about is actually still relevant today? I mean, it's been over 100 years. Surely things have changed.
Right. That's a big question, isn't it? And it's one that's worth exploring in more detail. Yeah, I mean, things have definitely changed since Bax's time, but the question is, have they changed enough?
Right. Like, how much of what he was talking about still resonates in the 21st century?
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen huge strides in terms of gender equality, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, women can vote now, they can own property.
Right. Things work.
They have access to education and healthcare.
It's a whole different world.
It is.
But
No,
even with all that progress, there are still these underlying inequalities that Bax was talking about.
okay, so what are we talking about here? Give me some examples.
Well, we still see things like gender-based violence, the wage gap,
Right.
and the underrepresentation of women in leadership positions.
Yeah, that's true. But like on the flip side, there's also a lot of talk these days about biases against men, especially in areas like family courts and custody battles.
That's right.
So it's like maybe the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction.
It's possible. Bax was really concerned about that, you know? He thought that in the rush to empower women, the legal system might end up disadvantaging men.
It's like that whole idea of unintended consequences, right?
Exactly. And I think that's something that's really relevant to the red pill community today. There's this sense that the system is rigged against men, that the rules have changed, and that men are now the ones who are being marginalized.
Yeah, I'm seeing the connections here. Bax's work, even though it's over 100 years old, It kind of provides this historical context for a lot of the concerns that men are raising today.
Absolutely. He was talking about these things way back in 1908, long before the red pill even existed.
So it's like maybe some of these issues are more deeply rooted than we realize.
Right. They're not just a product of modern day feminism or whatever.
It's like they're baked into the system.
Exactly. And that's why Bax's work is so important.
It's like he's giving us a roadmap to understanding these issues, like a historical lens through which we can view the present.
I like that. A historical lens.
Yeah.
That's a great way to put it.
So even though Bax was writing in a very different time, his work is still relevant today because it helps us to see how the past shapes the present.
Exactly. And I think the key takeaway here is that we need to be aware of these historical patterns, these underlying power dynamics that continue to influence our lives.
Okay, I'm with you. So what's a takeaway for the guys listening out there? What can they learn from all of this?
Well, I think the biggest lesson is that we need to be critical thinkers. We need to question assumptions and dig deeper into the historical roots of these issues.
So just accept what you're told at face value.
Right. Do your own research, consider multiple perspectives.
Think for yourself.
Exactly. And I think that's especially important for those of you in the red pill community. You're already challenging the mainstream narrative. So keep doing that. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better understanding of these complex issues.
Well said. It's been a wild ride through history, but I think we've learned a lot today. We've seen how legal systems can change over time, how social attitudes can evolve, and how the past continues to shape the present.
It's been a journey.
It really has. And I hope this deep dive into Belfort Bax's The Legal Subjection of Men has given you all some food for thought. Remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about the history of these issues, the better equipped we are to navigate the challenges of today and create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
That's all for today. Folks, thanks for tuning in to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration into the past.